Paul Anthony Wallis is a popular speaker, a researcher, and author of books on spirituality and mysticism. His work probes the world's mythologies for their insight into human origins and human potential. He's also a healing practitioner and has worked as a theological educator, training pastors in the interpretation of texts, and also as an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And he recently released a controversial book in the same mould as the Chariots of Fire called Escape from Eden. Paul joins us now. Hello, Paul.
G'day, Dean. Thanks for having me on your show.
Absolute pleasure, Paul. Been meaning to speak with you for quite some time, and the book you released back in May, Escape from Eden, has certainly caused a bit of a stir around the place. But the first question I just wanted to ask you is why you wrote it.
Certainly. The first reason was an ultimate frisbee injury, which is a code in the book for all the times when the universe has given me some time to do some actual study. And I knew that the next time I had some time and some opportunity, there was something I wanted to get back to and take a look at that had been rumbling away in the back of my mind for a long time. And it goes right back to when I was 11 years old, and I first encountered Erich von Däniken, author of Chariots of the Gods, and it was being discussed at a dinner party that my mum and dad were hosting, and my ears pricked up when I heard this conversation, because I had always thought there was an anomaly in the story of us, that there was a gap in our ability to explain ourselves as an intelligent, conscious, technological species. And Erich von Däniken had put his finger on that. At my school, which was a Church of England school, I felt that the religious answers I was getting were a bit lazy. God made us, didn't quite seem to explain why we're so clearly an animal like the other animals, only a little different. And then when I went to science for an answer, it couldn't quite explain where our consciousness and higher intelligence had suddenly come from, because it's only because of that that we're at the top of the tree. And Erich von Däniken pointed out this anomaly and suggested that an external intervention in our evolution would make sense of both those questions. And that made sense to me. It actually led me in a funny way to becoming a Christian. And I was in ministry for 33 years and very involved in preaching from the Bible. In fact, I taught courses to pastors in training on how to interpret ancient texts, the Bible in particular. I worked as a church doctor, an archdeacon in the Anglican Church. And in all that time, I had the opportunity to teach from the Old Testament. And I taught through the book of Genesis many times. And each time I did it, there were questions that bothered me, funny anomalies in the story, the kind of things any child would point out if you sit down with the Bible and read to them. So why does it say, let us make the humans to look like one of us? Well, one of who? And then the snake suddenly appears with no introduction. Who's that? And couldn't God see something was going to go wrong? Why didn't he anticipate that? Why is it the death penalty for eating a piece of fruit? Now we've got a genocide in Genesis 6. Explain a loving God and a genocide to a child, and you'll get into some tongue twisters. And as a preacher, you do your best to make sense of it, but each time I did that, I thought, no, there's something else going on in these texts. I nearly need to dig deeper into these and work out what's the real story, what's actually going on here, because these stories don't work as moral tales. You can't read them in a fundamentalist way and correlate them with anything. So what's the right handling of this? And then a gauntlet was thrown down in 2009 when the Roman Catholic Church convened a colloquium. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences had this symposium for 5 days to discuss, and here was the title, The Theological Implications of Contact with Other Civilizations. And I was blown away that they were having that conversation. And then when people came from that symposium and met the press on behalf of the Vatican, they were basically saying there's no issue. We should all be ready to embrace a brother or sister alien. We shouldn't be surprised to meet them because they're in the Bible after all. They're in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I thought, could I really have missed something as glaring as aliens in the Bible? So when I had my ultimate Frisbee injury and had the opportunity to sit down and do some deeper study, that was the gauntlet I took up.
Yeah.
I went back to Eden, back to the texts to ask, are there really aliens in the Bible? And when I did a little bit of translation work, it became very clear that the ET presence in the Bible begins in the first 2 verses and doesn't disappear until the end of Revelation. And that was the beginning of escaping from Eden.
Did you expect to be led to a world of extraterrestrials when you started that research?
Not to the extent that happened. No, I had an idea that there may be an alien or two rumbling around somewhere in the text. Bible readers would be familiar with Genesis chapter 6, which is a story of hybridization between human beings and something else called the Bene Elohim. And that story of hybridization between humans and higher beings is in mythologies all around the world. So when I went back to do the study, I thought, well, maybe Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, who said this is in the Bible, he's talking about that. But it's actually far, far bigger than that. And as I say, it begins right at the beginning and it ends right at the end. And it's like taking the red pill. When you do the translation work, it opens up a completely new world and you can't go back to reading it the old way. So it was a surprise to me what I found, and then working through the implications of it and finding correlations in contemporary science, etc. It really has shifted my worldview in a very exciting and dramatic way.
But it doesn't make you any less a Christian, does it?
Well, not in my opinion, but it depends who you ask. But I still am a believer in Jesus. I seek to live my life by his teachings. I believe in God. But how that's framed does alter when the big picture changes and you realize that you're living in a universe that's more populated than you thought it was. And stories that you thought were about God in the Old Testament turn out to be about something completely different.
I mean, I always encourage people to question everything. And I mean, as I mentioned to you before we started this interview, I was dressed down by a Catholic priest in elementary or primary school. I was only 10 years old, and I asked the question during a religious instructions class of if God can be anywhere, anytime by just twitching an eyelid, why does he need a fiery chariot to move around in? It just didn't, I mean, even then it
Yeah,
didn't make sense to me. And I
it's
missed
a
the
good
next month of
question.
that class. I mean, I was basically put in a room by myself while that went on for 2 hours every week.
That may have been a mercy, Dean. But I'm interested, the fiery chariot that you were talking about, which one was that? Because there are a few interesting
Yeah,
moments, aren't there, in the Old Testament when they turn up?
the one that really kind of bugged me was when Moses went up the mountain, and and he was met by the big ball of fire, um, and then was taken on board, and and he was gone for a while. And I always thought, well, I mean, couldn't God just zap him up to heaven if that's where he wanted
Yes,
him to be, and then show him what he wanted him to teach?
yes. Yes, that's right. There are a few moments like that where if you're just reading it without any preconceptions, you'll say, what technology is that? It's when we come to the text with religious expectations that we think, oh, this must be a metaphor. Uh, but you take the plain meaning of what you're reading, and you've got fire, you've got smoke, you've got noise, you've got a vehicle. And it's interesting in that moment with Moses, God says to Moses, when I come back, I'll come back in my Shekinah. And that gets translated as glory. But if you dig down into the etymology of that, a Shekinah is a big, heavy thing that clearly flies. And the other place that this big, heavy thing that flies is mentioned is in the prophet Ezekiel,
Mm-hmm.
where he gets picked up in the big, heavy thing that flies, and he describes the flying journeys it takes him on. And that's a really really funny episode because they're the pilot, who Ezekiel describes as being like a human being, is trying to talk to him about religion and politics, but Ezekiel is fixated by the big heavy thing and how it works, the noise it makes, this glass canopy, he's never seen anything like it, how the wheels work. And he's clearly looking at a piece of technology, which he is really describing. So you asked a very, very obvious and good question. What's this technology? Why does God need it? And it's disappointing, let's be honest, that you were responded to in that way, because anyone who studies theology, and a Roman Catholic priest will study it for 7 years, will have read these texts and will know that they are based on Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian texts that don't have God in them. They have beings from another planet in them who have technology with which they arrive and manage Project Earth. Those are the stories that the ancient Bible stories are based on. And I think it's a shame that your priest couldn't have a conversation with you about that.
He was a pretty fiery Irishman, so I didn't want to push him too far. But but anyway, yeah, and even my lovely wife, I mean, she's very, very spiritual and faith-based, and I mean, so am I. But she's got God in the box, and I haven't. So we'll get into a little, back and forth, and not far into an argument. I don't want it to ever lead into an argument, but I just back off, and I think she just needs to grow a bit more in her.
Well, people have different ways in to the topic. And for me, I've mentioned a couple of ways, but another way is if you do have a faith in Jesus, then immediately that's going to give you questions about the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. Because if God is as Jesus suggests he is, then you go back to the old stories of Genesis and further into the Hebrew scriptures, and you think, well, that can't be right. This can't be a story about God. So what is it about? And for many of the early church fathers, right at the beginning of Christianity, that was how they got into this ET narrative, by beginning with Jesus. But I now find I'm meeting with people who get into this territory from all sorts of start points, either through a study of archaeology, neurology, study of mythologies, astronomy, DNA research. There are so many ways that people can study, and they'll swallow a red pill, a new picture will open up, and they'll suddenly realize, oh, there are other entities in this big world that I've just been exposed to. And often we will meet in a discussion about ETs or UFOs or abduction stories and realize we've come from all these different start points to the realization that this is what we're looking at.
Theologian and author Patrick Cook once said that gods have been mistaken for aliens rather than the other way around. I mean, would you agree with that?
Gods have been mistaken for aliens rather than the other way around. Well, for me, my answer to that really begins with the texts and understanding what the texts say and what the texts are about. And it's been a really fun and exciting journey for me, discovering the correlations among texts, narratives from all around the world. And in those, I find stories about other kinds of being that then get interpreted as gods. So I guess that's the way around I've seen it.
Let's talk about the Bible then. Firstly, I wanted to ask you why some books, and I thought some very important books, were banned from the Bible. They weren't included in the original text. Enoch, for example.
Yeah, Enoch is really interesting. Enoch is part of the Bible in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but it isn't part of the Western canon. It isn't part of the Catholic canon, and it's not part of the Hebrew canon. It's intriguing, though, because when you read the story I mentioned from Genesis 6, which is the hybridization story, the writer tells that story so fast that he clearly thinks the reader knows the story from somewhere else. And the Book of Enoch, among other things, unpacks that story in phenomenal detail, When you go to the New Testament, to the book of Jude, when he wants to talk about Enoch and the Genesis 6 story, he quotes the book of Enoch word for word. So Jude expects his readers all to have read the book of Enoch. The versions that we have of it are fairly late, but they appear to refer to an ancient tradition. Why didn't it make it into the canon, except in Ethiopia? I think it's because there are claims that it makes that are just too far out of the neat and tidy monotheism framework that Judaism and Christianity operate in. And scholars generally agree that the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, took their current shape in about the 6th century BCE. And I believe it's at that point that all this range of texts got harmonized and monotheized, and the appearance of extraterrestrial species in those texts sort of gets airbrushed out. And as they tightened up the canon, they simply didn't include books where the airbrushing wouldn't work. And the Book of Enoch was one of those. And the same process happened in Christianity, really. There were what came to be viewed as fringe sects within Christianity that had written other literature. I'm thinking about the Gnostic sects. And there was just too much in them that was untidy, that didn't fit the story of monotheism. Too much about other entities, too much about altered states, too much that was really esoteric and inviting too much thought, perhaps. And what emerged with the canon that we have is neat and tidy. It is a monotheized view, and it was one that Imperial Christianity, the Imperial Department of Religion for the Roman Empire, found it could work with. Because if you've got one god at the top and perhaps the emperor above him, or maybe the other way around, then you can create this neat and tidy world where a good Christian and a good citizen are more or less the same thing. And historically, that's what happened. So all the untidy other stories sort of got brushed aside. And then when you get to the 4th century of the Common Era, you have Emperor Theodosius effectively illegalizing the teaching of alternative views. And so these other texts not only were not in the Bible, they actually had to be hidden for their protection, buried in the desert or kept by esoteric groups and sects, except the stories survived and keep resurfacing. And when that colloquium happened back in 2009, it was extraordinary because the most conservative pope in my lifetime was saying that all the push and pull of those debates, all that discussion really needs to go back on the table because we have missed something very important about the nature of our universe.
Yeah. Other stories in the Bible, I wanted to kind of get your interpretation on the story of Noah's Ark, especially, gathering 2 of each animal on the planet and putting them onto a boat. The theory is, the ancient astronaut theorists suggest perhaps it wasn't so much animals going onto a boat, but DNA being stored. How would you interpret that story?
Yeah, that's a great question. People, when they read mythologies, tend to fall into one of 2 camps. They'll either want to read them in a fundamentalist way, where every detail that's history, that's science, that's exactly what happened, or they try and read them as fables, or this is some kind of a moral tale. But as I've seen the correlations between mythologies from all around the world, I come at it with a different question, which is what memory is being carried by this story? And it may be that what we have in the story of Noah and the ark is like the movie version of what happened. And as you know, when movies are made, you've got to make it cinematic. It's got to be visual, it's got to be memorable. And story has to address those same needs if it's going to carry from generation to generation. So I think what you said is quite possible, that the story of animals coming 2 by 2 or 7 by 7, because there are 2 different versions in the Bible of the story, it echoes the stories from the Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Sumerian, which agree in very interesting details. The dimensions, the volume of the ark, there's a variance of 4%, I think, across all those different ages and cultures. So you see that and you think, well, there's something in this. You certainly see the dependence of the cultures, but maybe there's something very factual in here. But I agree with the view that what we're looking at certainly is a survival plan, and it may not have been a huge floating zoo with every species on the planet. It may have been Zisudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Noah, his family, and his farm. Or it may have been everything in seed form, the seed form of all the plant life we'd need, the seed form of all the animals that they'd need. And read some other versions of that story from around the planet, and that kind of rings true to me. There's an amazing story from the Zulu tradition, the story of Unkulunkulu. The first man on earth is the story. And this people group, the Zulu, whose life is all about living in harmony with the land, have a story that says that everything on the land came from outer space, but it came in seed form. It came in seed pods. And it's a very cinematic story in itself, but it's interesting to me that it goes to that concept. Not all the animals stepping out of spaceships onto the planet, but things arriving in seed form and developing here. And so it's in that kind of a way that I would look at the story of Noah. Something happened that's been recalled all around the world, and it may have been a little bit less cinematic than the version we know.
Another story, and again, as a child, it kind of always bothered me, was the story of Jonah being swallowed by the fish and being able to survive 3 days inside a fish, which we all know is impossible, because I think, within the first day, you'd be broken down by the stomach acid in the fish. But I mean, was it more likely that he was picked up by a UFO?
Well, something I have discovered since researching Escaping from Eden is that there are stories all around the world, but in particular from the southern cone of South Africa, all up the western seaboard of Africa, into the Caribbean, out to Brazil, and then as far east as the Philippines. Stories of abductions of humans from near the water who are taken to underwater bases. And it's part of the wider story of hybridization that the world has remembered. And I couldn't believe how many of these traditions exist. The idea that there are people who look like us, who have bases underwater, and people within in the UFO community talk about this, underwater bases, seeing craft going into the ocean and emerging from the ocean. So knowing that, I go back to the Jonah story and think, what is being remembered here? Here we have a very, very ancient story of an experience that a man had that's been told and retold. Is it possible that what swallowed him wasn't a fish? Well, it's certainly not possible that it was a fish. If something happened and it's not just a story, then the explanation from these other stories, the Mami Wata tradition, might have something to tell us.
Because we have to remember too that back in those ancient times, they described things, I guess they saw things in a different way, not as we see them now, and they would interpret them the way they see them. So
exactly.
So a
yes.
craft would be a fish
Yes,
in the
that's
water.
right. And something that flies might be a bird. Exactly. There's a text where somebody says, I'm going to fly in my bird from this country to this country. And we read that with a 21st century eye and think, that's not a bird.
Mm-hmm.
That's something else. But they are just using the language they know, the images they know, to try and give the reader an understanding of what they saw. And the Bible is full of things like that, for sure.
Yeah. And, as I said, I like to question everything. And I guess this one will probably get me some backlash, but was Jesus himself an alien?
Well, as soon as you reread the Hebrew scriptures and realize that there are ETs involved in the engineering of Homo sapiens as we know ourselves to be, or the adaptation at the very least of Homo sapiens, and that there is this hybridization story that comes in Genesis 6, these interesting people groups who seem to be related to different ET demographics. You get to the New Testament and it throws up that question: where does Jesus fit in this story? Something that really intrigues me, there are two things. One is that how the early church fathers viewed Jesus. There was a big discussion in the early church as to whether or not that 6th century edit of the Hebrew scriptures should be glued onto the writings of the apostles to make a Bible. And among the church fathers saying, no, don't do that, was a whole number who said the explanation Plato gives of the world is a really much better preparation for what Jesus was on about. And Plato talks about consciousness and human consciousness. He said that each one of us is a being of consciousness, first and foremost, that consciousness exists before this material life and it survives this material life. And that while we're in this material life, we're wrestling with the question of whether we can do consciousness, love, intelligence, and harmony as a society of individuals with free will. Well, when I read all that from Plato, I thought, hang on, that's how Jesus describes himself. In the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. That's what Plato says about all of us, that we begin as consciousness, part of the cosmic consciousness. Then the Word became flesh. We beheld his glory, full of grace and truth. Plato said that's true of all of us. We become human beings. We have this individual experience. Then at the end of John's Gospel, Jesus is praying to the source, who he calls Father, and he says, I'm going to be returning to you now, back to the glory we shared together before the foundation of the world. Plato says that's the story of all of us. So having gone back to Plato to find out what these church fathers were on about, I thought Jesus's journey is a model of our journey. He's the same as all of us in that respect. So now I appreciate his sameness a lot more than before. But then there's the question of, well, so how is he different? How is he unique? Luke has this story of his conception being somewhat different to most of ours, that there's some external intervention that is at the beginning of Jesus's story. And if you go to paintings from the Renaissance period, you will find that the artists who depict that moment of Jesus's conception depict it in a way that's very unlike what's in the Bible. You'll see a UFO up in the sky. You'll see a laser beam coming down into headgear that Mary is wearing. They're telling a different story. Where have they got that from? They haven't got it from Luke. They haven't got it from the New Testament. They've got it from another source, and they're putting that story out there in painting form. So when I look at that, I ask the question, is Jesus more conscious of his cosmic origins and his cosmic return because there was some intervention that made him different? People talk about star children, which is a story of children who have emerged somewhat different because there's actually been some intervention in their conception and gestation that involves contact with our neighbors. And as soon as you start listening to that and realizing that's a huge story and an ancient story, you go back to the story of Jesus and you think, well, he's definitely one of those. And again, Luke carries the story of this light leading the Magi to Jesus's house. If that is not a star, which it clearly isn't, a star can't take you to a house, then you're looking at what we now call a UAP. And if there was UAP interest in this baby Jesus, again, that hints at the possibility there's a more direct connection with our ET origins and our ET wider family. So now I would say, yes, I think Jesus falls in that star child category. And that's part of why he had this higher level of consciousness, why he had this incredible and unique role in our history as a society.
Speaking of higher level of consciousness, are you familiar with the CE5 community? The close.
No, I'm not. No, tell me
Well, of
about
course,
that.
I mean, they're all about the higher consciousness and making contact with ET, but in a very benevolent way, and meeting ET on their level of consciousness. And there's certainly a strong argument now that, of course, disclosure's been in the news for for 3 or 4 years now, and perhaps the key to disclosure is the CE5 community, and maybe ET is trying to get us to a point where we're on the same level of consciousness as they are, so they can communicate with us on that level. But there are so many people now who are coming out and talking about their experiences, and I'm not talking about thousands, we're talking about millions.
Yes.
So it's quite fascinating. Paul, what about the Bible itself? Do you think it's been written before, maybe several times? Do you think this might be the third, fourth, or fifth time around for us?
Well, I think fourth or fifth time around for us as a civilization.
Hmm.
Yeah, well, let me go to that part of the question, because we do have in the Bible texts that are very, very ancient. And by the time you're right back at the beginning, Genesis 1 to 11, you've got roots in Sumeria for that literature. And then some of the Sumerian stories are retelling even older stories. But if you just start at Genesis, by the time you're at the end of chapter 11, you will have read about 3 resets of civilization, 3 planetary resets.
Mm-hmm.
And once you realize you've read 3, it raises the question, how many resets might there have been? Plato believed that every 5,000 years or so, our vulnerable planet gets impacted by movement of objects in space, such that it triggers an extinction level event and everything has to reboot. So he believed it had happened several times. The Vedas, I believe, teach that we're on about the 5th reset. But that might just be the 5th reset that we know about. If there had been a civilization on Earth prior to us, prior to the dinosaurs, prior to the Cambrian explosion, it would be compacted within millimeters of strata in the planet's record. We just wouldn't know. So to go to the first half of the question, scholars know a fair bit about how the Bible evolved, but the ultimate source of these stories is far, far more ancient. And then the memory that we have of planetary resets, that could take us way back into geological time.
Hmm. I mean, in recent times, the discovery of Gobekli Tepe, is from about 12,000 years ago. So, I mean, that's well outside the Genesis timeline.
Yes, it's really interesting. I mean, generally at school, you'll be told that civilization began about 7,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent. But then in 1998, Manfred Hoyne led a team from the University of Az in Norway and the Max Planck Institute to the Fertile Crescent, to southeast Turkey, to a place called Karakadag, and they identified what is the first evidence of farming that we've ever found, which is an extraordinary thing in itself, because this tribe, or one family, as Manfred Hoyne suggests, had worked out how to genetically modify 11 naturally occurring plants so they could be cultivated. And then they cultivated them. And at the same time, they worked out how to do animal husbandry. It's an incredible thing to work out all in one go in one place, but it looks like that's what happened. And yet, just a few hours down the road is Gobekli Tepe, which is the megalithic remains of an earlier civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if there's actually a tipping point we're looking at there with the closure of one civilization and the emergence of a new one just after the end of the last ice age. Göbekli Tepe was very carefully put into storage about 8,000 years ago. That's why it suggests that something older was being protected. And it's just one of a number of megalithic evidences around the planet of an earlier civilization whose story we don't know. You go to Japan, off the coast of Yonaguni-Jima, off the coast of Cuba, off the coast of Malta, off the Gulf of Cambay of India, and you will find the remains of streetscapes and buildings which would have been above sea level no more recently than 10,000 years ago. So we know there was a civilization prior, but we really don't know much about it. But as we find these sites and as we uncover through new technology other buried cities, we're finding evidences that these cultures were all connected, because we find the same motifs in their art and carvings that suggest there is a cultural connection that seem to span the world. So that tells us there's a lot we don't know.
Mm. Well, we've spoken about the Bible. So, you know, ET or not, I'd say ET is pretty well invested in us. I mean, they must have realized at some stage that we would develop to such a point where we would be intelligent enough to investigate things ourselves and eventually work things out and kind of decide, well, you know, this square block doesn't go into this round hole. You know, what's going on here? I mean, do you think that's the case?
Yes, well, in the Bible itself, there's a very disturbing story that happens in Genesis 11, where the people on earth appear to have developed spacefaring technology, and it's the Babel story. Babel means a gateway to the powerful ones, and the Sumerian version of that story makes clear what the gateway did. It dispatched people from here to stations in the stars, what we would call space stations. And a population arrives from somewhere and says, we can't have a spacefaring human race, thank you very much. And they bomb us back into a pre-Stone Age condition. They attack human progress to the point that we lose the power of communication and speech, and we have to re-evolve that. Mm-hmm. We're now in a somewhat different situation, I think. Later stories talk about a sky council, and again, this is in mythologies all around the world, of different ET demographics who all appear to have some stakeholding in Project Earth and Project Humanity. And they kind of hold each other in some kind of a stable relationship, a little bit of conflict from time to time. I actually think that's the situation we're in now. Ed Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon, talks about we need to be able to take our place among the community of spacefaring civilizations. That's what he was allowed to say, even while bound by layers and layers of official secrets laws. And yes, that would be wonderful to see. And I have no doubt that there is contact and communication going on, such as with the SIGI community, with particular demographics. But I think we've got some ET presences who are friendly to humanity, some who are coldly indifferent to us and are here for other reasons, and some who may even be hostile. And the Sky Council is there as a group where they kind of hold each other in abeyance. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if from time to time, when there are spats of sightings and such, if that's to do with a little bit of a breakdown in that stability. So how neat and tidy it would be for us suddenly to put up our heads and say, we'd like to be part of the discussion, I don't know. But I am certainly with Ed Mitchell in saying we all need to be on the same page. We all ought to know what's going on. I'm not comfortable with the idea that there may be governments around the world who know all about this, while poor Joe in the street is completely in the dark. And I don't think that's a way forward. So all the things that are happening with regard to disclosure, I absolutely applaud. I'm really excited by the changes in the last couple of years where we've had the US Navy, US Department of Defense, the Pentagon acknowledging that we have been engaging with UFOs in all the 70 years since that exploration was classified, and that we have ET technology. That's now been out in the news. It was on CNN, it was in the New York Times. And I hope that catches people's attention and they begin to think, well, what does that mean? What is known that I would like to know? And I think it would be wonderful if we could all arrive on the same page so that we can begin to do the work necessary to play our part in a more populated universe.
So why do you think the church doesn't really want to talk about or mention the word UFO or aliens when we're talking about our past?
Well, I know that some believers struggle with it because they don't have a box for it in their theology. And that was my worldview for a long time. I believed in God, the devil, angels, demons, humans, animal, vegetable, mineral, and nothing else. And so if you hear a story about something else, you try and squeeze it into one of those boxes. And so I do come across people from time to time from church quarters who, if they hear something they can't deny in terms of ET contact, they'll say, well, that must be demonic. Or they'll say, well, that must be an angel and you're just calling it an alien. And they can't quite do business with it. And that's why I think that colloquium in 2009 was so important. The senior exorcist for the Roman Catholic Church, Monsignor Corrado Balducci, stood up and said, when people report ET contact, abduction experiences, they are not describing a demonic encounter, and it's not a psychotic break of some kind. They're describing a totally different kind of entity, one that merits serious study. And I think the church and the believers need to get a hold of that and realize that's the case. All we have to do is to read our ancient texts with a bit more careful translation and realize it's been in our tradition and in our literature from the very beginning. And we have to have other boxes and other categories in order to see what we're seeing and understand what's going on.
Yeah. So if disclosure ever happens in our lifetime, full disclosure, and ET says, hey, we're here, we've been here all the time, do you think the fractured religion or religious boxes will collapse and suddenly we'll all become just the one religion? You know, when we talk about religion collapsing, if there is disclosure, is that what they're talking about?
Well, people often suggest that might happen. Obviously, the colloquium was part of the Roman Catholic Church preparing itself for that moment. In fact, they gave every appearance. They thought some disclosure was going to be made by another authority, and they wanted to get in first so that they could say, oh, don't you remember we talked about this? There's really no issue. And in a sense, I think there is no issue. I think Christianity can accommodate what's going on if it will have an honest conversation about it. Islam can say, we knew about this. We have the tradition of the jinn. Other religions around the world have other language for it. The Diwatas, the Dili Ingonato, they have words for these things, the Mamiwata. And so I don't think it would blow apart world religions. Whether or not that's a good thing is another question. I think the greater challenge of a sudden disclosure would be the political implications. If people suddenly woke up to the fact that we've been lied to and manipulated and things covered up to the extent that there have been, I think the trust in authority would be the real hot potato. And I think that's why there isn't going to be a big disclosure moment from government. I think what's happening is a soft disclosure process.
Mm-hmm.
Where bit by bit, drip by drip, we're getting the picture. We're hearing now from the DOD. We're hearing now from the US Navy. We're hearing now from the Pentagon. So that by the time it becomes inescapable and we're all realizing we're not alone, we will have all more or less worked it out from the things that have been dripped. And I think that's happening in order to avoid the sudden shock horror, I've been lied to, what do I do now kind of moment.
Yeah. So escape from Eden. So you talk about most of what we discussed here in the book and more.
Oh yes, escaping from Eden. It begins in the texts. It begins in Genesis. It goes from there to the sources, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, Assyrian. It goes from there to mythologies around the world. But then it goes to contemporary areas of science as well. DNA research in particular. Neurology is another fascinating one. Archaeology. astronomy, and it finds that there are correlations in these fields that really confirm that we are in a populated universe, we're part of a wider ET family, and that we cannot understand who we are until we are willing to hear what those stories have to tell us and understand that there is memory in it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
all that's there. And where that leads, what really excites me about it is the question of human potential. If that's who we are, what does that mean is possible for us? And I'm really intrigued by the fact that the cultures that have curated this story of ET contact, ET adaptation of our ancestors, those cultures all have shamanic and mystical traditions aimed at elevating our consciousness. Part of the story of our development is that those who intervened in our evolution upgraded us, and then downgraded us so that we could be more easily managed.
Mm-hmm.
And that downgrade is a wonderful and fascinating moment. And it just hints at the possibility we can re-upgrade ourselves, be more intelligent, more conscious, and live a different and better life because of it. And that excites me, the idea that we can have a better human experience, live better as a society and better as human beings, and have a more empowered and deeply interesting life because of it.
What about a follow-up to the book? Will there be one?
I'm working on it right now. And in that, we drill down a bit deeper into some of these stories, but there's a lot more first-person connection in the sequel, where I'm going directly to the experts who are doing the research and relating to my own story of why it is that the author is particularly driven in this topic. So watch this space. That'll be coming out. We're aiming for springtime next year for the sequel.
Great. Escaping from Eden, available at, I guess, all good bookstores, online as well, Amazon, from your website?
Absolutely. Yes, you can follow its progress on paulanthonywallis.com. That's Anthony with an H, Wallis, W-A-L-L-I-S, paulanthonywallis.com. Go to fifthkind.tv for the website where we host our documentaries. You can also find Fifth Kind TV on YouTube and the Paul Wallis channel on YouTube as well.
Paul's been a fascinating discussion. Hope we can have you on again in the not too distant future. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dean, for having me on. It's been great fun.
Great. Thanks, Paul Wallis, joining us today.